what would it look like if it was people like me who know, born in a thatched hut in Kenya and went to Oxford, and there is 100 of us who are creating transformation for others born in thatched huts. Like, that is truly interesting. New ideas come to the table when people who have a very different kind of lived experience are in an MIT media lab.
Welcome to episode 47 of People Are the Answer. I truly believe that people are the only answer to the world's many problems. I'm Jeffrey M. Zucker, a serial entrepreneur, here to learn how innovators are creating outsized, transformational social impact. Today's episode features Dr. Lydiah Kemunto Bosire, founder of 8B Education Investments. Lydiah is a native Kenyan and started her life in a thatched hut. She's managed to make the improbable journey from Kenya to Cornell, Oxford, working at places like the UN and World Bank, to starting her own business to help make the journey less improbable for other African students. Africa's population is growing at a significantly higher rate than the rest of the world, and it's time that its citizens got equal educational opportunities. Lydiah and I discuss her journey through her life and career, starting 8B, and why this cause is so important to the future of our world. Here is Dr. Lydiah Kemunto Bosire on People Are the Answer. Lydiah, thanks so much for joining me on People Are the Answer.
Thank you for having me, Jeff.
It's an absolute honor. I was really excited to learn about your work and when you guys reached out. So can you just start off by telling us, who you are and where you're based?
So I am a founder of 8B Education Investments. We are a mission-driven company that is providing loans to African students who go to global universities. By that, I mean universities in places like the US. And I am currently located in the Ithaca, New York area. And the reason I end up here is that I came here many years ago for school, left, and then came back again. So it's one of those wonderful instances when life takes you in exactly the right place. And the Cornell area, the Ithaca area has been that for me.
I love that. And glad you were able to get back there. And in life in general, what would you say motivates you?
I'm driven by connecting talent with opportunity. I love it when people who are the right people for particular opportunities get those opportunities. I want to see more of that happen for the African continent. And I was really lucky in my life to get a series of scholarships that led me to both Cornell and Oxford, worked at the UN, the World Bank, realized that the way I multiply my impact is having more people like me in those rooms. And that's in part because I happen to be so lucky to be from a place where brilliance is everywhere, but opportunity is not. And now the place where I find myself, meaning in North America and across OECD countries as a whole, there is a lot more opportunity. And we just have, the demographics are telling us we will need more and more brilliance to fill in those opportunities. So it's this wonderful place of sitting in a bridge where I can be able to connect the two. And that really is what drives me and motivates me.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing. And can you tell me about, where you grew up and what was it like?
Yeah, so I'm born and raised in Kenya, and Kenya is too general. I'm really born and raised in Kisii, Kenya. This is in Western Kenya, a small town. And what was it like? Well, school mattered a lot. My parents valued education a lot, and many parents in the places where I'm from still see education as the bridge to opportunity. Education still is the vehicle for social mobility. And so it's taken very, very seriously. So that's the context where I grew up. Went to Kenyan high schools, a number of boarding schools in Kenya, where many kids go away from home very early because good schools are where good schools are. Not every neighborhood has them, so you're sort of taken to those. And more importantly, got a really good high school education in Kenya that allowed me to be a very, very lucky winner of a scholarship to go to further high school in the UK. So growing up in Kenya was such a blessing because you are in the midst of many, many striving people, but you're also aware of what more there could be. And I feel like my relentlessness in the work that I do is in part, inspired by that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it really made you who you are to grow up there. And, um, I'm sure, I know most of my listeners are probably American, a little bit beyond, but uh, can you just, for those that aren't that familiar with Kenya, can you sort of, in, knowing America yourself, can you sort of paint what it was like there and, try and put the listeners sort of over there and get an understanding of what it was like?
Yeah. So, Jeff, when people think about Kenya, they will think about safari and they will think about, Lion King and
Right.
Madagascar. Um, and, there is that, right? It's a beautiful country with an incredible endowment in wildlife, and the infrastructure for tourism in Kenya is fantastic. And people who visit, and I encourage everybody to add Kenya on their bucket list if they haven't yet. People who visit do truly have a wonderful time. Kenya is also a place that exists in the public imagination as a place of luck, right? A place of, but I mean, want, a place that has a lot of need. And many African countries are painted that way. And there is an extent to which that's true, because in material abundance, where you are in the economic development ladder does greatly affect what outcomes your population has.
And it's obviously a big country too, so it can vary quite a bit.
And it can vary quite a bit within it. And I'm using sort of Kenya to talk about Africa as a whole, which
Hmm.
also varies dramatically, of course. But Kenya in particular, Africa in general, does exist in the public imagination as the place that needs to be saved and rescued. What that image does not convey is the amount of talent and brilliance in the young people across that population. Just like any normal population anywhere, you have a distribution curve of brilliance, and it's exactly the same in Kenya as it is in Kansas, as it is in Hawaii. And the challenge there is that people do not have access to opportunity, but the brilliance absolutely is there. And so that's the piece that I think when people are thinking about Kenya and what we need for most citizens of the world to live in dignity and in shared prosperity, sometimes we forget that many places of the world could be incredibly well developed if we had more connections of the brilliance there with the opportunity that is elsewhere. So again, I'm going back to the work that I do, because Kenya truly, and the African continent as a whole, are those places that we don't really think about them as fairly, because the stories we've heard about them in the media don't give us a full picture of what these places
Right.
are. What they don't have what they lack in material wealth, they more than make up in the ingenuity of the population. Just incredibly hardworking young people who have over-indexed on grit. Just the kinds of people that would really make a transformation in the right places, which is obviously, as you know, what I spend my time doing.
Yeah, it's incredible to hear and to think about. And I can only imagine all the brilliance that's pent up there from lack of opportunities. So it's really incredible that you're bringing more opportunities there. So thank you for that. And you know what was how would you describe your childhood? Did you experience things that made you feel the need to give back in the future? What sort of led you on the path of giving?
When I think about the 9-year-old me, that's the first time when I, 9 or 10, when I go to it was an international Girl Guide, Girl Scout event for the first time. in my life, I was in a room with people from everywhere in the world, and I always knew about other places in the world, but they didn't exist in such proximity as they did as a result of that camp. And I remember being asked by the leaders of this international Girl Guide event that I attended to sort of lead the prayer on behalf of the Girl Guides for the opening event for the camp. It was a week-long camp, and that was such an interesting moment for me. And that's the earliest point when I have this recollection of realizing that I had something to give. There was always the wanting to be part of the infrastructure that is bringing opportunity, because that's what you always experienced as a resident of a poor town, that it's outsiders that came with things that you needed. But at that point, around age 9, 10, when I attend this camp, and I have a role, I have something to say, and I am chosen to say it, and to invite everybody to be part of this. I remember that that's one of my earliest moments of thinking, with a stage you can get things done. But what also happened, as I grew up in Kenya, and realized the gaps between those who had more access to education and those who didn't, is being really grounded in the understanding that is already in the air we breathe, that education opportunities can be truly transformational, and global education opportunities are truly transformational in ways that are generational. And so all of those things are in the back of my mind as I set out my journey. The understanding that there's a role I can play. The world is big, and I have a role in it. Education is particularly door opening, and it's not always clear what the red thread is, except when you look back and you realize there is in fact a red thread that enables me to then put all those things together, in service of the communities that I care very deeply about. But yeah, I mean, the for your audience, what I would say is, when you look at pictures of places like Kenya that you haven't yet visited, and always ask the question, what else am I not seeing? Because there's so much more.
Absolutely. And it's really interesting to hear how you sort of came up through that mindset. You mentioned finishing high school in the UK. And then I understand that you received a scholarship to Cornell. So, it sounds like you're enabling people to sort of take a path that you worked really hard to get to and try to just make it a little bit less difficult to get on that path.
That's correct, Jeff. My journey to a scholarship to Cornell was something that I considered to be like winning a lottery. There was no obvious way that that happened, except that, a series of accidents, one after another, had to happen in exactly, that sequence in order for me to arrive at applying for a scholarship initially that was to a 2-year pre-university course in the UK, from where I then applied and received a full scholarship to go to Cornell. And when I say it's accidental, Jeff, what I mean is this is, nobody was going on Google and finding out about, scholarships in American colleges. The first scholarship I got was because I struck a conversation with a girl who happened to be a sister to another girl that I knew. And this girl that I was speaking to told me that the other girl had received a scholarship to the UK, and that it was genuine, and that they didn't have to pay anybody or know anybody to get it, and just gave me all this information, and then showed me pictures of this girl who had the scholarship in like London in a double-decker bus, like all the things that make these things real, because it's true. If it's not real for you, you will never even think of applying for it. So a lot of just randomness around knowing that scholarship existed, combined with another set of randomness of me actually finding out an ad in a paper that happened to be about that scholarship in like months later. So many things had to be true for me to get that opportunity. And what we're trying to remove right now is that while there is more information because Young Africa is online, it isn't any less confusing. Because if you go to Google and say African student looking for scholarship abroad, like how do you even start, from the thousands of hits that you receive, narrowing down to what you need? We have created within 8B a platform that is an end-to-end solution for globally ambitious Africans. What that means is you don't have to do that search on Google. You come to our platform and we tell you which schools are good to apply to for which programs, because not all schools are created equal, what the range of scholarship opportunities look like that are out there that are tailored for African students, what loan programs you can apply to, and that is the area that we are truly adding the kind of value that doesn't exist in the world for African students today by creating a tailored loan programs for African students. So if you shake every tree for the free dollars and we tell you which trees to shake and not enough fall down, here is how you complement the resources that you have so that you can go to school. And then, what does it look like for you to be prepared for a global workplace, which is very important because the future workforce is going to be an African driven workforce just because of how demographics look. So that's what we do. And those opportunities earlier that I accidentally ran into, I want to systematize that luck so that the next person who is looking for this isn't guessing or randomly encountering people who give them the information. That if we're out there enough in all the places that Young Africa is, people will be able to find this information with greater ease.
Yeah, and it's great how as we're going through sort of your life story, it's all tying back into what you're currently doing and helping people, get where you were so, both fortunate and hardworking to get. I know part of it was luck. And so, you went to Cornell. What was that experience like? And then I believe you went to Oxford afterward.
That's correct. So Cornell was wonderful, not least because I met the man who became my husband there, and he isn't from Cornell. He was actually a Swedish exchange student in Cornell at the same time as I was there. And we both left the area, but the reason why we live here now is that he's in the wine industry, and the Ithaca area, the Finger Lakes area, is very big in that. But quite apart from that, Cornell really served its role as an educational institution. I got from it what I needed. I got 2 degrees in 4 years. I had a bachelor's in government with a concentration in international relations, and then a master's in public affairs. And while there, I was doing a lot of work in AIDS activism, HIV/AIDS activism, because this was a time when, HIV was the first pandemic before we had coronavirus, and was doing a lot of global activism around the issue because the countries that were most affected weren't getting the support they needed. And, I, while there, applied for a master's in public health at the Harvard School of Public Health, and they gave me an offer, but they gave me no money. And so now my streak of getting scholarships had ended because, again, scholarships do not exist to meet demand. They really just depend on which philanthropists or which pool of which pool at the university is still available to address and bring in some kinds of students. And it's wrong that an entire continent's ability to take talent abroad currently depends on wealth and scholarships. Anyway, so I did Cornell for the master's, worked in international development for a few years after that while applying for additional grad school. And always the challenge was, can't fund it. There's nobody who's going to pay for it if I can't, and I don't have enough money in my bank account to pay for grad school. And then eventually I got an offer to Oxford that the first year was funded. So that was a second master's. And I was thrilled to do that. While when I transferred to continue on with a doctorate at Oxford, that wasn't funded. So then I was back to my, don't have that scholarship streak anymore. You have to figure out how to make it work. And you swiftly realize that as an African student, there really aren't places where you can borrow money to go to school. You either have it in your bank account, or you can work for it if the university would allow you to do an installment plan, or you simply have to drop out. Like you you can't do it, or you can't enroll in the first place. So because I was already there on a scholarship for the master's, I was able to continue and didn't need to like have a chunk of money all at once to pay. I ended up making it work. I know many African students who didn't, but that's how I ended up at Oxford. And some of the financing challenges both there and as I was in finalizing up in Cornell and looking at other opportunities, those things also inform what I do today, which is how do we make sure. But there are ways of looking at somebody's journey and determining, Jeff, that this is a person that will have a trajectory where if you lent them, they could pay you back, right? Because it ought not to be that when you are a student in Oxford, the thing that determines whether you can get a loan is that your father earns $500 a year or whatever it is that my parents' income was. Like, that's ridiculous. It is completely irrelevant to my direction of travel. And yet for the vast majority of lenders, it will be what is your parental earning and capability, what is your country's GDP per capita. All those things should be relevant, because I am in those schools. What we're preparing young people for is being in a global labor market, right? So I as you can tell, it all takes me back to the things that I'm spending my time solving right now.
Yeah, it's really great to see how it's come full circle. And um, you mentioned your work on the AIDS in general, and I know you worked in the UN, the World Bank, a variety of leading NGOs. Can you talk about your career path prior to 8B?
If you had told me when I was leaving Cornell that I would work at the UN Secretariat and the World Bank and I would quit, I would have laughed, because there is no way that that would be true, because at that point, the places where I thought I can make the biggest difference were in the spaces where, everybody knows that's the place where the biggest difference is made. And so I was really lucky to work initially. So I've worked across many UN entities. Most recently, before I left to start 8B, I was in the UN Secretariat. So that's the sort of headquarters in New York that, in political affairs. So supporting the role of the UN in conflict prevention, which is a big and lofty goal. But I am a political scientist by training. So that was as good a position as one gets, given the kinds of things that I'm trained for and care about in the world. But I also previously, before that, I worked on global health in the World Health Organization. I worked at the UN Population Fund on women's health as well. I was in the World Bank on conflict prevention, and really just know that know the space of multilateral work really well, and was very blessed to get those opportunities. What the way I describe those experiences, Jeff, many people maybe in the listening audience might know, a place like McKinsey, right, where you know a lot of things about a lot of things and have to advise industry leaders across a wide range of sectors in the economy about everything. Working in policy in the UN Secretariat was that. So we were in the policy shop, and for breakfast, you might have to provide advice on the security implications of climate change. And during lunchtime, there is a paper you need to be giving, a senior official talking points on the world drug problem. And in the evening, it's, the development implications of, the rush for rare earths. Like, it really is as wide a range of issues, except that they're not on like the retail strategy of Walmart. It's about, how to think about the world, right? And that's where I thrived doing the work that I did. What was true, however, Jeff, as I did that work, was that I felt the singularity of being the first, the only, one of the very few Africans in the many rooms that I was in, which should be surprising because I was in the UN Secretariat, but I was also in the Political Affairs Department in the UN Secretariat, which does tend to not look as the world does. And I think that kind of being the only type, my kind of lived experience in the room um, uh, there's one of two reactions. One is I will be the best in this thing that I am doing, or I will figure out how to get 10 more people like me in this room to do these things that I am doing. And I chose the latter. So, because it felt like the former would still keep me complaining about like, why are there not more people? But I kind of know why. They're not in Columbia University and Oxford where everybody's recruiting from. So then let me go to, and get more people like me in Columbia and Oxford, right? So, in making those having that those moments of feeling, am I really truly making the biggest difference that I can make? It did feel to me that there was more to be done, and it wasn't in the room, it was outside the room. But as I said, as I started, Jeff, if you had told me that that's the conclusion I would arrive at when I was leaving Cornell, I would have not believed you. But that's where I ended up.
I mean, it shows that you're open-minded, and that, the fact that you noticed and felt the need to attack that, I think is shows your selflessness and your care for your people where you come from, and just for people generally having equal opportunity. So I definitely commend you, and I'm sure that you learned an extraordinary amount while in those positions prior to making the switch, though.
Yeah, because I feel that I know the variety of ways in which the world changes, right? And I'm fluent in that because I have worked, I've been on the front row seat in many of those places where we are trying to make some seismic shifts in the world, and in what it looks like to arrive at shared prosperity. And that sounds a bit fluffy, but truly that is what you do at a place like the UN and the bank. You think big thoughts and get governments to support you in making something of those big thoughts. And so, having spent so much of my career in those spaces, when it was clear to me that there was a human capital angle that is missing, which is, there is this other whole swathe of humanity that we have underinvested in. And what would it look like if they were part of all these decisions that we're taking about how the world changes? It felt quite obvious to me as a gap. It felt obvious to me as well because the way development tends to work is where human capital and the expertise that drives transformation comes from wealthy countries, and countries like Kenya and African countries are on the receiving end of that expertise. What would it look like if it was people like me who know, born in a thatched hut in Kenya and went to Oxford, and there is 100 of us who are creating transformation for others born in thatched huts? Like, that is truly interesting. New ideas come to the table when people who have a very different kind of lived experience are in an MIT Media Lab, or Georgia Tech, with all those resources around them, and are creating transformational ideas. And in all sectors, that is true. So I think it's a long way of saying that being in those spaces and realizing that the totality of what we are doing is fantastic, but even how bigger it could be if we had different kinds of brains in that room, for me, has been really energizing.
Yeah, I can hear that. I can hear your passion, and I appreciate that. And for me, bottom up solutions are generally the best way to solve problems, not top down. And these organizations were just sending what they thought was going to be helpful from the top. And the best way to do it is to have people involved, like you're saying, from all of these areas that aren't currently represented. So,
That's correct, Jeff, but not as recipients of our brilliance, but
right.
as equals on the table. And there's no way
Exactly.
to be a villager in Kisii, Kenya and be an equal to my World Bank colleagues. But if you went to Oxford and come from that village and have been worked with them, then you are an equal. Then your ideas are just as valid. And I can imagine this is true across all sectors. I mean, climate is an area where everybody's spending a lot of time today. Less than 1% of climate science is coming from the African continent. What that means is that we're creating solutions without a big chunk of human brain being involved in it. And by the way, that happens to be one part of the world where the impacts of this will be very deeply felt. It's a miss for all of us, right? Who knows what new things we could be thinking up around, like alternatives to plastics, if there were like 100 more kids from Kisii, Kenya in a climate lab in Stanford, right? That's really what drives me. It's that oh my God, all those human brains that we could be realizing their fullest potential. Let's get on with it.
Yeah, it's so true, and you're articulating it very well because I'm sure you're obviously very familiar with it. But it is invigorating to me personally just to hear this, and it makes me want to get involved. And thank you again for the work. And um, once you saw this gap that was very clear to you, what were your next steps?
So the first step was panic, because after you decide you need to do something, you actually have to do it. And so panic because there's so much to give up, right? You know, when you have a Kenyan passport, like at that point, when I left the UN, I only had a Kenyan passport. I have recently become a US citizen as well, which was very convenient to do. But as a Kenyan passport holder, your travel becomes extraordinarily difficult if you no longer have a diplomatic passport. But that's, I'm saying that in jest, which is true, but it's also in jest, because another big challenge is, who am I in the world if I'm not this person who is a diplomat who works, you know, at the UN or the bank or whichever, you know, place I'm working, which opens every door. You know, what does that mean in terms of the ability of people to take me seriously? And you don't realize how much people who are taking your call because you are Lydia at the World Bank and not Lydia, you know, the person who might also have some really good ideas. So there was a lot of that. And then, you know, my mom couldn't understand it. She was like, "What's wrong with you? You don't work at the UN in order to quit." So there's all of those things to navigate. But the first step was making a determination. So then what did this look like, right? Because the thing had been on my parking lot, Jeff, for a really long time, because I've described finishing undergrad and not being able to get that first grad degree out of the Harvard School of Public Health. So I didn't like wake up one day and decide I needed to do AB. It had been really, you know, what is the word, simmering in my, I don't know if things simmer in a parking lot, but you know what I mean, for quite some time until I took the courage to actually do something about it. And so, you know, once it needed, I was clear that it could be done. It was figuring out what is the structure within which it would get done. And I spent a good part of a year wandering the wilderness of the foundation and international development world to see, is the financing of African students going to global universities something that I could get out of the door as a not-for-profit? And then I swiftly realized I couldn't, because then that would put me in direct competition with money that is going to primary education and secondary education, even if the pathway to sustainability was obvious, because when you lend money to Lydia, who goes to Cornell, she works at the World Bank, and 3 years later she pays you back. You're fine. You're a business, right? While if you're giving money to, you know, Lydia's cousin in the village to go to primary school, that is a charitable donation. There is no way to get it back, right? So that modality was always really clear to me. But the operational capital to get out of the door would still be money that is competing directly in a very, very small pot with money that is going to basic education and other things that I simply couldn't get enough interest there. And so we decided that this had to be done as a Delaware C corporation, raise equity capital like all companies do, and be very ambitious in the fact that we had native impact in what we were doing. In other words, we didn't have to like, when I say native impact, I mean you don't have to concoct the impact. It is in the core of the business. Like if the business is lending to African students, and by providing that financing, you 20x somebody's income, in that business is the impact, right? Because a Lydia who would never have gone to Cornell if she hadn't received the scholarship now gets a loan and goes to Cornell and 20x's her income. That is a business that is both impactful and business advancing. And so that's what we did. We, raised a pre-seed round of capital, got, some people excited in what we're doing, which was really good, put some infrastructure in place, raised a seed round like everybody does, and, got even more people excited. And more importantly, last year at the 2022 meeting of the Clinton Global Initiative, we were able to bring a lot of partners together, including Nelnet Bank, which is subsidiary of Nelnet Inc., which is publicly traded. The bank has agreed to partner with us for a $30 million line of lending that is focused on African students coming to the US. At that meeting, we're also able to announce partnerships with an education testing service that owns a lot of the tests that African students have to do when they're coming to the US and making those affordable. We really were able to bring a lot of people around the table around the agenda of enabling African students to access global innovation ecosystems towards the end that I mentioned earlier. The world just optimizes its resources in human brilliance when you get more people from a place like the African continent that has been so underinvested in. When you get a lot of those young people in the places where the future is being built, they're better for it and the world is better for it. So this isn't like, oh, how do we marginally help 5 more Africans? It's truly how do we transform the place that Africa occupies in our imagination and the contribution that the continent as a whole can make to the collective solutions that we face as humanity. So really excited about that journey. But, I think you asked me what was the first step. I gave you all of the steps. So we, with some difficulty raised capital and are on our way to be as helpful as we can be to the cause.
And in determining that it made the most sense to go the business route, was that daunting, or did you have any familiarity with what that process was going to look like? Did you have new partners that came on board to help?
All of the above, yes. Daunting because I have a doctorate in politics. I do not have an MBA. So, there's just that first moment of self-doubt. Oh my God, what did I just get into? Because the tools that I needed to use were tools that I was familiar with to the extent that, innovative finance, and therefore, how do we remove risk to allow capital to flow into spaces where capital isn't flowing? I had some of that from spending time on both the World Bank, but also with the UN World Bank partnership from the UN. So I know what those things look like. But to be able to actually put the nuts and bolts in place and to think about, what it means to raise venture capital. There was a very, very steep learning curve there. But one of the things when you have as many degrees as I do is that you just love to learn, right? It's it's a new challenge. Okay, I will figure out what this thing means. And we're doing a convertible note. Okay, we'll talk in the morning. I'll tell you exactly what I, what I need and what I mean, because I will have read everything that I can find on it. So no, it was definitely daunting, and I feel like I'm still learning. And it's one thing when you work within structures that already exist and are fully baked. It's another when you're creating those structures yourself, right? And I'm finding this every day, both with my company, but also in the partnerships that we're creating. So for example, I mentioned the partnership with Nelnet Bank. We're creating something together, and we're figuring out, so what do we how do we think about risk? What are the possible solutions that we can import from other parts that have done something similar but not quite the same? What are things that don't exist and we have to create? So it's very exciting to be able to do that. But it's also different in the sense that what success looks like is different, right? For now, success is not that big idea was accepted, but that a very tangible thing happened in the world. A number of an amount of money that wasn't previously available to be loaned to African students is now available to be loaned to African students, right? It's really that kind of tangibility, which is quite different from the work that I was doing previously. Having said that, I do feel that what I described in sort of the, policy shop, where you need to learn how to learn and be an expert fairly swiftly on the range of things you need to be responding and advising on. I feel that has served me really well. So I am open to asking questions where I don't know, and to learning what I need to be learning, and to be apologetic when I'm misstepping, and asking for further clarity when I need to ask for that. It's the best possible way to learn.
Yeah, I'm sure that humility has served you well. knowing what you don't know and surrounding yourself with brilliant people is certainly a good path to success.
That's correct. And I'm really lucky to have a partner in the business who is a veteran in the student finance space in the US, not Africa. And so him being able to bring his learnings from the US to the Africa space is valuable. And he knows a lot of things that I wouldn't have thought I needed to know. And it's very good to have somebody like that. And then really wanting to make sure that we are bringing people who know what they're doing to help us do what we collectively need to do.
Well, I'm going to ask two things that I think sort of go together. So, one, I believe you developed a tech platform, so I'd like to get an understanding of that. And two, how does a student go about getting one of your loans?
Yeah. So what we do on when someone goes to 8B, the number 8, the letter B, .africa. And Jeff, if I might just say one thing, what actually, when we chose the name, the thinking was, what does Africa need to be fit for purpose in a world of 8 billion? You may know that the world hit a population milestone of 8 billion recently. We did form the company before that population milestone, but it's also in anticipation of the world of 8 billion being a world that will be predominantly young Africa. And to be able to prepare young Africa to be an engine of productivity and growth requires a symphony of solutions, of which certainly what we do as 8B is a part. And so when a person comes onto 8B, there are three things that they can get support on. And we are the first entity to have all of those things in one place. A point to make ahead of that, which is the process of studying abroad is full of a lot of friction. There are very many things that you have to do that are done on very many different websites. You have to figure out where you're going to school. First of all, which country, and then which school. And each school likes to position itself like it's the best in whatever it is offering you. And if you're a student in Kenya, one student sitting under a tree reading a book in Ithaca and another one doing so in Springfield, Massachusetts, and another one doing so in Florida, they all look the same. How do you make a choice among all of this? So students can come on board for the journey of figuring out how do you get to the right fit university. And then there is the exercise of how do you finance it. Actually, even in the right fit university, subsections include what is an essay? What is the SAT and the GRE? How do you do for them? All of the things that are obvious for an American student with a guidance counselor and not so obvious for an international student. So making sure that all of that information is available. And then supporting students in their search for financing, both through our own financing product, which is the 8B loan, which I'll tell you how one applies for in a sec, and a financing marketplace. And the marketplace includes loans from others who can support an African student, mostly when they have a co-signer. And there's some loans where students can get without there's some loans they can get without a co-signer, but those loans are typically optimized for students from India and China. So really just making sure everything that is out there that has passed our smell test is available for the student on our platform. And then obviously we've curated as many scholarships as can be found on the platform as well, so that students start with, where's the free money? If it doesn't exist, do I give up the dream or can I borrow, right? And if I'm borrowing, here are the range of options. This is the whole world of borrowing. We have it there. How do I borrow? And then the third piece is the careers piece, where they upload their resume. We can help make it better. We can connect them with mentors who can help them, figure out how to position themselves. And eventually the intention is that we can actually connect them to jobs. We have a few companies actually we're discussing with what that could look like. And so that's really exciting, because there is also in the air we breathe the sense that we should be having more diverse pipelines going into jobs, and we want to be one of the partners that help corporates and employers get there. So that is what the platform does. It's this end-to-end, supporting African brilliance to have a global impact. How does a student find us? Typically, a student will find us because we have, if they're from Kenya, Ghana, and Uganda, we have country managers in those countries, so they would have heard about us on the ground. If they're from elsewhere, they might have found us on social media or through various partnerships and media engagements that we have. A student would go to 8b.africa And then if what they're looking for is financing, which is the question you asked, they would go into our financing landing page, because the top nav of the website will ask that, we'll tell them, what are you looking for financing? You click on our website, and on that website you then see, here's where you search for scholarships, here's where you do a pre-qualification if you're looking for a loan, and if you already know that what you want is the 8B loan product, here is where you click to apply for it. We have a very robust back end, Jeff, that is going to be too boring for your audience, but it means that because consumer finance is very, very highly regulated, all of this is supported by a very robust infrastructure that has to meet all the regulations of disclosures and all what has to be done for student lending to be done right. We have all of that infrastructure, and it manifests itself in the sense of, if a student has selected a particular product, they need to know what is the rate, what does it, what is the calculator, what is a monthly repayment look like, and all that kind of information has to be available, both in the marketplace, i.e. here's a range of loans that you could potentially qualify for, and for the 8B product. And then at the end of that, if what the student did was to look for, was going to pre-qual, and it's like 5 minutes process, they know which borrower in our list could lend to them, and it might be us, but it might not be us, it might be someone else. And if they went directly to the 8B product, they would then know they qualify for what we have, and therefore here's the documentation that we need, and so on. We're really keen on supporting students who are going into the fields that are obviously in demand, the STEM, health, accounting, finance type of fields. We also want to work with universities in order to create tailored financing programs for them. Many universities just can't afford, the full scholarship that Cornell gave me. It's very, very hard. But if we have programs with universities where they have deferred tuition arrangements, right? Student can pay some money up front and some money over time, and we can lend to the student in order to make that arrangement possible. We would love to work with universities to do that, but the university has to be willing to enter into that arrangement, which gives them some skin in the game. Because if the student is able to repay, it would be because they actually had a good degree that gave them a job, right? So universities being able to do that is going to be part of how they diversify the people that come in through the door. What is the last thing I'll say on this, Jeff, is, I know you haven't asked me, why does this matter for the US, is that diversity in the international student body in the US is sorely lacking. There is just diversity in the university as a whole, and that's a separate problem from diversity of the international student body. So to just clarify, universities cannot interchange these numbers. Universities cannot use their number of African students to satisfy the fact that they have underperformed in recruiting African American students. They need to be doing both, and they're different lanes. The international student lane is very different from the domestic student lane. I'm talking just about the international student lane. Even if my showing up in a classroom is a growth experience for an American who has not encountered anybody like me. And even if I'm from the Bronx or from Nairobi, that still makes a really big difference in their ability to understand that, brilliance comes in all colors. But there is a separate thing in terms of numbers that is useful to point out. On the international student side, universities have relied heavily on students coming from China and India. The India pathway of students continues to be very robust, but not the China lane of students, because of a bigger geopolitical story at play. As a result of that, when you had, roughly 1/3 of international students in US universities coming from China, you're having those numbers shrinking rapidly. That is happening at the same time as China is not growing any younger or having more young people. The most young people in the world today and for the foreseeable future are coming from the African continent. So you have two, and then American, the population, the numbers of young people in the US and across the global north, frankly, are not growing. They are, they're declining. We have more older than younger people. So what is to happen to
So in a business sense, In a business sense, the target market is going to be coming from Africa. The business sense for these universities.
It has to. You can't,
Yeah, exactly.
there's no, like, you can't manufacture more kids from Wisconsin to show up if you're a
Right.
University of Wisconsin. It just doesn't, there's no way to do this. You need young people to show up, and they're either coming from your neighborhood, and if there are not enough of them, they're coming from other countries. And if you're not getting them from the usual countries, you need new pipelines to other countries that you currently don't have pipelines to. And that is really what we see ourselves doing, enabling those pipelines to be created to the African continent, and not just students that can express interest and qualify to enter, but can also pay, which is where the financing piece is absolutely critical.
That's really interesting, and appreciate you going into that detail. And feel free anytime to add things that I'm not asking, because I thought that was incredibly valuable. And sometimes I think maybe you made the point how important this is, but I think it's important to state explicitly to the listener, because just because I'm on board doesn't mean everyone is yet. And um, I really like that idea in terms of getting universities interested in that. You're providing this pipeline to these students. And right now, do you have many partnerships directly with specific universities, or what types of schools do you focus on?
Yeah, that's a good question. We do have some university partnerships, but there's more interest from universities than solutions. In other words, many universities that need this don't even know that a thing like us exists as a solution, right? And so I think there is a really big gap there, where we are an answer to very many universities' questions around how will we
Mm,
get pipelines from the African continent, and hopefully students who will be able to pay, if not all of their way, some of their way. And what do we
yeah.
need to do as universities in order to ensure that that happens? So that is very useful. Right now on our platform, we have about 200,000 African students all of who want to study abroad. And, they will all be in some stage of interest, and they will need to be courted by the right universities. And in some cases, it's going to be around, what proportion of financing can a university provide, which is where, as I said, our lending program, if done in partnership with universities, can be a lot easier for everyone. There is a lot of interest on the part of universities. I saw recently the current um, uh, lead article, the cover page article for the Chronicle of Higher Education is asking, is Africa the next source of international students? And the Chronicle is a leading publication for the higher ed industry in the US. We were partly interviewed for that article, but what it's really saying is universities need to grow their enrollments, and Africa is part of that story. It'll be harder or easier. Flights to Lagos are expensive. What we're trying to do is to provide an online version that reduces the number of flights you will need to be taking to Lagos, Nairobi, and Accra, in order to create, those pipelines of students, right? And so there's a lot of work to be done there, but universities, anybody in higher ed is concerned about enrollments. They're also concerned about questions around diversity, and if you can get both, it's a good thing. They're also obviously concerned about outcomes for their students. One of the things we tell them is that a student coming from us is going to be over-indexed on grit. They're not going to be dropping out, and they are working so hard because this is generationally important for them. So it's just it's a kind of student you want to have, but people don't know that they exist in as large numbers as they
Yeah.
do. And the reason they don't is because, as I mentioned earlier, Africa exists in the public imagination as this place of absence, right? Not abundance, and particularly not abundance of brilliance, which is what we're telling people. Wait, hold on, hold that thought. Let's tell you a different way of thinking about this.
Well, that it makes so much sense to me. Have you been? I'm sure you have. You've been at this for 5 or 6 years now, and have you been, getting this message out to more and more universities?
We really have, and what we are grateful for is that we feel like the message from us is being complemented from the message in the air that we're breathing around what's going on demographically around the world. And it's making people realize that no, it's not optional that you have to think about Africa. You do have to think about Africa,
Yeah.
right? So that we don't seem to be, just raising an issue because we seem to be, we are from the place and care very deeply about it. But it's that, there was a recent article in the New York Times talking about, rules for an aging world. And rule number 5 was, the world is going to be run by the African diaspora. Like in your AI lab and in your, whatever the future of automation is, you still need human power that is going to be running that. And in an increasingly aging population that the industrialized countries are, there's no substitute for thinking about global labor mobility. Countries like Germany and Japan are already doing it, which is very, very interesting, really making it very easy for very, very skilled foreign labor to come in and get the productivity to continue, because otherwise what we're talking about is a reduction in productivity, right? And I think places like the US might be a little bit behind. Canada is ahead of the curve. There's a lot there in sort of the global labor skilled mobility space that the US in the past, Jeff, was really ahead of, because a lot of brilliance in this country does come from people who came into, Stanford School of Business to do whatever they came to do, and then they stayed on to build some really big, magnificent things in this country. We're in a place where we are a lot more reluctant to look outward, but our demographics demand that we think about our talent in a bit more expansively than we're currently thinking. And so, we looked forward to working with people who are thinking expansively about talent for building our futures.
Yeah, no, I it makes so much sense to me, and I am excited to learn more about this as I go forward. And I mentioned that you've been at this for 5 to 6 years. You said you have over 200,000 students on your platform, which is incredible. In general, how have things been going over these years?
It's really interesting to hear you describe the time frame, because while I would say this has been in my parking lot for eternity,
Right.
we had a first close of our seed raise, the first close of our seed raise in December of last year.
Oh wow. Okay. Yeah. I think on your resume, it's like this started 5 or 6 years ago. So I wasn't sure of what that
No,
process entailed.
no, I wish it had been, by then we would be like, miles away. But I think there was the early phases of trying to set up, and then finally setting up, and then finally raising
Yep.
the funds that we need in order to actually get out of the door.
I can relate to projects taking a long time and being slow going to do them right.
Yeah, but also I think because once you decide the format that the thing is actually going to happen, and that your entire time is going to be dedicated to it, and that the format is going to take is a particular one, then you start scaling the hill of raising financing for it. And I think we've been really lucky to have closed the seed round that we did, but it also is, raising funding is a thing, right? And we were really lucky to get exactly the right kinds of partners out of the door, which we're so grateful for. And so really, when I say 200,000 students, that was in 1.5 quarters of deploying resources to that. So that's from like
Wow.
last
That's
summer,
incredible.
end of last summer, not even longer than that. So the amount of interest there is out there is just crazy big. And so what we are wanting to do by this, in the course of this year, is get that the Nelnet money that we're so excited about, the commitment of lending capital from Nelnet, get that out of the door and into student accounts at universities, which is going to be super exciting, because what we want Nelnet to be is an example of how other banks can work with us to expand access in what we haven't seen before. So I have nothing to say except I'm so delighted about what we have in store and about the partnerships we've brought around the table. And what we're building is truly relevant for where the world is. And the more people see that, hopefully the swifter the progress we make.
That's great to hear, and just the amount that you've accomplished in the short period since raising your round is just truly inspiring. So great work, and I know there's a lot of it ahead, but it sounds like you're on a really great path. And one topic you mentioned continually is the growth in Africa and how young people are. I think I've read that there's a median age of under 20 years old um, in Africa. Can you just talk more about that?
Yeah, no. So it boggles people's mind that the median age on the African continent is 19. By comparison, the median age in a country like Japan is 47. In the US, it's probably mid to late 30s. Um, you start to sort of get perspective. Africa has very many very young people. 70% of the population is under the age of 30. That is a very young population. It is also growing at a pace that is, about twice the global average. And so when people say that 40% of the world's youth are going to be from the African continent by mid-century, that should make people pause. That's a very, very large population of young people. And our task is to make sure that as many of them as possible have realized their fullest potential and can be part of the global workforce that will be having a lot of opportunity for them. And the more, and I say there's a symphony of solution of getting us there, but one of the instruments in that symphony is as many of them that can get into Cornell, as many of them that can get into our colleges in the global north, and be those stewards of future innovation, and the leaders of industry, the better. But there will be other pathways that don't rely on them coming here, right? It'll be pathways that depend on young, brilliant people who are skilled. And Germany has recently opened this pathway. You don't need to have gone to a German university or to even have a job already offered. If you have particular kinds of skills, there is a pathway for moving there and finding a job that you can help fill, because there's a lot of opportunities there. So there's a conversation here that we haven't fully wrapped our heads around as a world, of what it means when you have this incredible gap between one part of the world that has got very many young people and not very many opportunities, and another part of the world with very many opportunities that need to be maintained for productivity and levels, living standards of living to maintain, but not enough young people, right? So there has to be ways of making sure that there are connections going on there, and that's something that is across all disciplines, Jeff, right? Even if we're focusing on STEM, health, and accounting, business, the kind of labor, the kind of expertise and professionals that you're going to need is going to be across so many more sectors. And Africa is poised it just has a comparative advantage in young people, and it's poised to really take its role in this, in enabling shared prosperity, and we want to make sure that we can contribute to that.
As the population continues to grow, I know I saw a stat from the Brookings Institute that Africa is going to need an additional 12 to 15 million jobs a year to absorb all the people entering the labor market. In addition to getting greater opportunities for the brilliant minds in Africa, that can obviously translate back to growth there. Do there any other important solutions that people need to be aware of to how this job growth is going to get done?
Yeah. So Jeff, I like to go back to the symphony of solutions. There isn't anybody who says there is one answer to a problem as complex, as how do we ensure that Africa develops and grows, lives in a different world from the world that I live in. And the truth is, we need a multiplicity of solutions. One of the things that we need, when I think about our work at 8B, one of the things that we think about ourselves doing is this lane, which is how do we get 100 times more Lydiahs going into places like Cornell, even when Cornell doesn't have 100 times more scholarships available, right? So we have created the pathway for that. But it's also, how do we get the kind of high level training that Cornell provides to other people in Nairobi and in Kisii, Kenya, so that they can also be very, very skillfully trained for a global workforce, even when the price point is in $40,000 or $70,000 a year, right? So that is, those are two things that are directly within our lane. But other things outside of that lane include, we need more primary education, more literacy, more secondary education, higher quality education on the continent, more space for students. So, in when you have, I think the number is something like there is one university per million inhabitants in the 10 most populous African countries. That is very few universities per the number of people who should be eligible. Should they all be going through secondary education to go, there are too few universities compared to how many young people demand them. And the stats, we can sort of wade into them and get lost in them. But the answer is there are not enough universities. There's not enough high quality universities. There's not enough education. We need all of those things. But at the same time, we need this pathway, Jeff, that is, how do we ensure in 15 years the guy who is replacing Sundar Pichai as the head of Alphabet was actually, their first degree was not in India but in Nairobi, right? That is also a future that we think is really important in bringing a whole set of new solutions on the table and a new workforce on the table. And so we see that as part of what we do. On the job side, there was a stat that I was looking at that, at its height, China's economy, which has been vibrant, was producing something like 11 or 12 million jobs. There's no way African economies that are not even one economy, right? That's 54 different economies, will be providing anywhere near the number of jobs that we need in order to catch the volume of young people that are getting into the workforce. There's just no way. It's not feasible. It's not possible. And we might talk about how we need to be retooling for the new climate economy, and we absolutely must, but that's still a really big scale. So we need all of the effort in making sure that Africa is creating the African countries are creating as many jobs as possible. But we also need pathways of ensuring that as many of the bright young people that are graduating from both African and global universities that come from Africa are getting in places where they can be part of productive economies to help lift the world up. We need all of these solutions. There isn't one that solves it.
So throughout all of your work, whether it was with 8B or in your prior work, is there a story that represents when you really saw how much you personally could affect change?
That's a really good question. Let me use a very recent example. I mentioned earlier that we were really grateful to be invited to make a commitment as part of the Clinton Global Initiative this past September. When we initially were invited to do that, so some context, the Clinton Global Initiative is a gathering where President Clinton and the Clinton Foundation convene change makers across all sectors to make commitments to do more. And it's a platform that I have known for a really long time, because the first time I worked on it was when I was at the I was at the World Health Organization about in 2007, whenever that was, many, many years ago. And we were working on a commitment at the Clinton Global Initiative on women's and children's health. So I'm really familiar with this platform and how it creates visibility. When 8B was invited to be part of it in 2022, I was so excited. And my ambition was, how do we get maybe $10 million worth of, commitments that we can announce? Because to make an announcement, you have to have at least 30% of the announcement already in the bag, and then you raise the additional 70. And my ambition was, we had only 4 weeks to D-Day, let's try and get, $10 million worth of something announceable for it. And Jeff, I was so surprised that we got to $111 million within that time frame, really reaching out to the people who we know care about this issue, and they know that we need to have more African access to global innovation ecosystems, but they can't quite figure out how. The tools that they typically use are charity tools, which have a problem scaling. And we're saying, here's a way that we can do this. We can use the market, let's create access to loan products, which then you don't need to have a scholarship, which is a $1 for $1. It scales at a much faster pace. And, as part of that, we got the Nelnet Bank partnership that is a $30 million commitment for lending to African students. So that is a very recent moment of realizing that, my job is to ask and other people's job is to say no. But when you put your mind to making a lot of asks, you can get a lot of yeses. And I'm really, really excited about what we were able to do.
Yeah, that's incredible. And I'll just add that I really do love the method that you're going about this, structuring it as a business. I personally think that business is the most powerful vehicle for change, mostly because it allows you to create sustainable change.
Correct. Correct. Because there's only so much money in charity, Jeff. And when
Yeah.
money is in charity, my view is that money has to be in charity that cannot, you, we use a charity model for things that cannot be solved any other way. I'm about to say something really controversial here. But one of the things that is true, there was a wonderful no, there's this guy, Lant Pritchett, who's at Harvard. He used to be at the World Bank before, and he's a very big. His research is a lot around questions like migration and mobility, and he was giving an example of this study that is so interesting, where um, $4,000 to $7,000, something in that order of magnitude, of an intervention per family was being put in place in a number of poor countries in order to help them arrive at income of roughly $400 a year. Basically saying we can move people from $1 a day or from zero into $1, whatever the metric was. But I would love to share this with you so that you find a way of sharing it with your listeners. The
Yeah.
point that he was making is that a lot of money can be spent in development interventions that have no sustainability baked into it. You're spending an order of magnitude or 2 orders of magnitude more to create a particular change. Whereas, if in fact what we were doing is enabling a person from that poor family to work abroad, do you know what that would do? It would 15x their income. And that would have cost us nothing. And by the way, this is in a context where, in fact, that would also be useful for the country in which they move to work. Right now, there's a lot of labor mobility happening to the Middle East and North Africa from sub-Saharan Africa. It'll be really interesting to see what systems can be in place in order to enable broader mobility of the manner that I'm describing. And for me, educational mobility is the most interesting thing that you can do because you're getting, your smart future build, the futures of the builder, the builders of the future into your classrooms. They know your systems very well, and then they build the future. And by the way, as they're doing that, they're sending money to their countries of origin, and that is so transformative from the places where they come, right? So I see very few things that have so many wins. The politics of it is very tricky, and that's the world in which we are in today.
It really is incredible. And one thing, that stuck with me, in you mentioning that charity should sort of be the last resort when there isn't another solution to the problem. And something that I preach on any episode where I get the chance is just that, yeah, I'm not a huge fan of the whole nonprofit versus for-profit structure. I think that sustainable things that are positively impactful are the most important. And if that can be structured as a business that regenerates capital to put back into the cause, that's for the best.
Exactly. And some part of that is that when we think about Africa, we don't think about very many we think of it in two ways. We think of it in a charity lens, and then we think of it in the extractive sector lens, right? I mean, you and I are on a phone, cell phone, and a laptop, and the supply chain of our batteries, start in the Congo, and not very many of us know where that is on a map, right? And so we think about Africa as the place where that kind of extractive of this very valuable minerals happens, but also the place where there's a lot of charity, and therefore we need to be donating and having, lemonade sales to donate to, which is why for me, the fact that we can reorient that to be, it's going to be the largest source of human brilliance in the next, 3, 4, 5 decades. What can we be doing with that as a business proposition? Because it no longer is a charity proposition. If you think about it that way, it's not people needing to be helped. It is brilliance needing to be connected with opportunity. And that opens up so many possibilities from the business side. And the challenge with charity as well is that it is limiting, right? If I stayed if I never went to a good school and ended up in a dead end job in like Kisi, Kenya, my dreams can only be so many. When you think about, opportunities, and I like to use the example of basket weaving, what development does tend to think is, oh, let's create a microcredit program that will get women in Kisi to be basket weavers, and then we can, they can sell the baskets up the market and they can pay back. An economy of basket weavers is still a small economy because there's only so many dollars going around, right? What does it look like if one of those women went to Cornell Business School, created supply chains to Target and Walmart, and suddenly those baskets are not selling in this little economy, they're actually connected to Target and Walmart. And suddenly that economy has grown from being an economy of basket weavers into a global supply chain. I'm interested in what it looks like to expand our imagination into the global. And that means people of those lived experiences not staying there. You mentioned something earlier, Jeff, about bottom up solutions being better than top down. I think we need inclusive solutions. My response is we need the woman from that village being the one who's creating the supply chains to, Tesco and to Walmart, because an outsider wouldn't even start to know how to think about this in a thoughtful a way. So we can't be stuck in this place where Africans belong in the village in Africa and everybody else comes and rescues them. We need a place where African brilliance truly belongs to the world, and whatever solutions come up as a result of that kind of dispersion will truly be the good solutions. And that will mean some people from the village being, on the board of Nestle, because then they realize that actually the sorghum that is grown in that village can be part of the foods, ingredients in whatever food Nestle is producing that is going to be really important in selling to New Yorkers, whatever it is, right? But you see how I get so excited when I think about, the unleashing of human brilliance. That is truly the thing that gets me really, really excited.
And yeah, I really appreciate your enthusiasm and your, bigger thinking and, not seeing limits to what can be accomplished. And I hope that you're able to spread those thoughts and enthusiasm as much as possible. I think that can be really impactful as well. And you mentioned earlier, being born in a thatched hut, now living in the Ithaca area, having gone to Cornell and Oxford and having your doctorate, what kind of perspective have you gained from such an incredible journey?
Oh my gosh. It's such a blessing, right? Because I don't know that there is any kind of experience that I don't have an appreciation for, right? Because I'm intimately familiar with such a wide range of human experiences, and really fortunate that I have been able to do that and realize my potential, and I get to pursue things that I care very deeply about, which is a massive privilege, such a massive privilege. So yeah, I consider myself highly adaptable, as you can imagine. I am comfortable with, the entire spectrum of human possibilities, and lived experiences, and it just, yeah, it humbles me a great deal. It humbles me so much, but it also means that I'm able to call out, from a place of authenticity, when people are wanting to rescue others and don't see the agency in others, or don't see that others are capable of doing these things themselves. It makes me impatient with that. And part of my call for I need more people like me in the room is that I know there is like countless people like me that should be in every room but can't be there because of all sorts of frictions, right? So I think when people start acting from a perspective of no, those people don't know, can't possibly be the decision makers, I get impatient with that because I know they can. I tell people that when I graduated from my high school, I was in a national high school in Kenya, and the way you get high schools in Kenya is by grades. So the best kids out of primary school get put in, the best high schools, which are called national schools, and the next lot down get put in provincial schools. And that's not strictly true, but mostly it works that way. You will find very many kids in the next school over, next level over, because there wasn't enough space in the first school. But generally, that's how it looks like. That was in the national schools, and just about any girl who was out of my graduating class in high school could have succeeded head and shoulders above my classmates in Cornell. Just about any of those girls. And, there was me because I was really lucky to get a scholarship. But there was 100+ girls in my graduating class, all of whom, without exception, would have just been ridiculously smart and ahead of the curve, right? So that I know that, right? And so when people look at a place like Kenya and see it as bereft of talent and brilliance and all of that, I I it creates an impatience in me, and it's not enough to be impatient. Then the action point is, let's unleash these possibilities to the world by making more pathways for that that brilliance to get into the places where we can truly be having a much a broader contribution going on to shared prosperity.
Throughout this process, this journey that you've been on, you've talked about leaning on people and learning from others. Has there been anyone in particular that's been a mentor through that process for you?
I've been really lucky to have many, many mentors. And I don't know that I was being intentional. If I were to talk to my younger self, one thing that I would, and I do this when I talk to younger students, is how important it is to be intentional with relationships, because they truly mean everything. I From my days of HIV/AIDS activism into moving to the UN, it's mentors that opened those doors. Like, you don't really
Yep.
apply for these jobs. I mean, you do, but you don't get them. The jobs that you get are jobs that somebody who knows you says, "Hey, I have an opening in my team. Do you want to do this?" And you say, "Yeah, I can do it." So that's how most of my opportunities, the opportunities I've taken up, have come about. It's because of people that I forged relationships with, sometimes less intentionally that perhaps I might have. People that I leaned on to ask for advice, or that I kept in mind as things were emerging, and like keeping them up to date. That's how many opportunities came to me. But more recently, what really sticks to me, Jeff, is the experiences that I have had more recently as we were raising capital for 8B. There, I have experienced for the first time sponsorship, where somebody takes you under their wing and uses their political capital to open every possible door. And that has been truly astonishing for me, because I don't think I realized that I was missing that. I always knew I could get advice and support, but the idea that people would repeatedly, week after week after week, say, "Hey, I talked to this person for you," and in fact, then I hear from third parties about how much they are talking about what we are doing, and how amazing it is, and how we deserve all the support. That has been completely mind-blowing for me. So I have, in my pantheon of fairy god persons, there is quite a few people that occupy that space, and many have emerged in this space as we're building, in this phase as we're building HB, and I am so grateful.
It's so good to hear that people step up and help as they can. Um, at this point in the conversation, if you'd like, you can ask me a question.
Oh, um, I'm so grateful that you're doing this. Um, what has been most striking for you about, because I don't assume that you spend all day thinking about Africa, or what people like me do, but what has been most striking for you as we've had this discussion about opening more doors for Africa to contribute to human and collective prosperity?
Yeah, no, I really like that you're asking a related question, because a lot of times people go off the wall. But um, I've long known that there's great population growth there, and I've certainly come across articles saying we're not taking enough from Africa, or not taking, but using the resources that are available there, and the brilliance, as you were describe it, available there, and how impactful it can be on the world. But I think what you've really opened my eyes to, just in this discussion and having the minutes to think about it, is just like what our future is going to look like in this world. And I haven't done the math to know the timing for all of it, but just the fact that Africans are going to become such an important, they already are an important part of the world, but I mean like such a majority part of our future. And I think that we all need to be aware of that, and to really take a hard look at a huge important area of the world that it seems like a lot of people choose to ignore, or like you said, think about stereotypically and look down on. And so it just really is something that I'm going to keep in mind in all that I do, and all the impact work that I do, and all of the business work that I do, just not forgetting about this huge important area of incredible people. I'd say that's really my main takeaway. And I also I feel like I had a lot of sort of things coming up in my mind as this was going, like, this could be sold easily to college admissions people, I would think, because it's so effective to them. Like, yes, I see it as important and impactful, but if people are worried about numbers, like, it actually works. Those are the best kind of impact, where it's an easy sell. So yeah, it's just invigorated me to want to help.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for saying that. And yes, I want to take you up on that offer. We need all the people, and it's, the college admissions people are normally broke, right? I mean, they don't, they've invested years, decades into their China pipelines, and they're just shocked that those numbers are no longer coming their way. And, so there's China and India, as I mentioned. Next to that is Saudi, and then South Korea. Saudi has also had some really interesting geopolitical issues, particularly in the Canada case. If you remember the journalist Khashoggi, who was dismembered in the Saudi mission in Turkey, that then led to a lot of diplomatic lash out against the Saudi government across many countries. Canada was particularly loud in that. And one of the results of it was, a threat of reducing the number of Saudi students in Canadian universities. So suddenly, diplomatic conversations on the one hand have a real impact on the number of kids in a classroom that are paying fees that keep the classroom lights on for everybody else, right? These things are real. And I think we are really excited to be in place as people are realizing that one of the answers to their solutions is going to be, you just need to go where the 18 to 23-year-olds are. And for the largest part, those young people are going to be coming from the African continent. The good news is they're prepared, they're smart, they are full of, energy and interest in an education. The piece that universities will have to innovate around is, how do we together enable it to be financially feasible? We're excited to be a lender. We would like some skin in the game from university partners, and we want to together be enabling African brilliance to have a global impact. When you think, Jeff, when you think about who are the young people building the future of cloud computing, your mind very easily goes to young Indians who are coming into our universities and doing amazing work for everybody. The mind could as easily go to African students if financing was as easily available for African students as it is for Indian students, because numerically they're actually fairly similar in numbers of the population numbers in the African continent and the Indian subcontinent. But the biggest roadblock, where it all stops, is that there is no money, and therefore people do not show up in the classroom. So I'm glad that I added some additional thoughts to your, to you.
Yeah, and I think another thought that comes up around it is just, there's certainly people in America and likely elsewhere that are ignorant to how impactful it is on our lives as well. Because there's people that'll say, like, oh, we have problems in our own country, let's work on those. And the reality is that serving this cause, among many others, serves the whole world and serves our future, and is the best place for our children and grandchildren, for the world that we want them to live in, is to embrace where the world is going.
I think so. I mean, I don't underestimate the political difficulty of thinking about when an upside down pyramid realizes its fullest impact. It's that we have very many old people, not enough people paying taxes to support them, and we need to have a lot of productivity to maintain standards of living. And we are used to the idea that you can get more people into work because you can pay more, but you need to be having people to pay more too. And there's a fact of life here that is really interesting to grapple with. And I'm always fascinated to see how insular societies like Japan, America is interesting and diverse, and yes, messy in all of that diversity and full of tension, but it has that experience of diversity. Places like Japan don't, and yet you see how they're moving at the policy level towards this accommodation of the fact that It's an older population. You need younger people to work in all those fantastic, innovative industries that they have. And they now have a pathway that is, a lot of skilled labor from the neighborhood, right? And that is so interesting for a society that has never done that, right? Prior to this moment we're in. And, seeing how other countries are doing it is very interesting. And they're easier and more difficult ways of doing it, but I don't underestimate the difficulty of it. I do think that this is, in the end, something that gets done because of necessity. Businesses will not allow themselves to go out of business because they don't have people to work. Like, we will always find ways of creating the vibrancy that we need as economies. And I have faith that we can be able to do that. I'm just excited that we're not really seeing around the corner. This is not around the corner anymore. It's in plain view that the direction we're going is where we're using more and more of the underinvested brilliance into the places where, it can help all of us do more and better, and really excited about the kinds of partnerships that can get us there.
My last major question is one I ask all my guests. If you could snap your fingers and fix one thing in the world, what would it be, and how do you think that change would reverberate?
Allow me to be selfish in this one, Jeff, and allow me to be selfish and go back to the point that we've just been making right now. There are very many ways in which we have gotten in the way of ourselves as a world because of the ideas that we hold about the African continent in particular, and people of African descent more generally. If I could remove that sort of preconceived notions that have no basis in empirics, and get people to truly see people as they are, which is, striving, hardworking, incredibly smart humans who are contributing to a common cause, I think there's a lot that could be solved as a result of that. And especially looking forward, as the world is going to, at least in the interim, be browner, and then in the long term be relying a lot more on the African diaspora population to the global Africa to meet some of our needs in human capital and driving forward innovation and productivity. It'll be a much easier world if people didn't have some of the preconceived notions that they have. I'll give you an example. When Ross do that had his article in the New York Times about 5 rules for an aging world a few weeks ago, the way you could summarize item number 5 about the diaspora, at least one of the less charitable ways, is to say, beware, Africans are coming. All of you women in the OECD, you need to have more babies. Like, I said, it's perhaps less charitable a way of interpreting, but it kind of came across that way. And I wish it didn't come across that way, because the world looks as the world does, and we can all, the tide can lift the boat together if we threw away some of our misconceptions and truly allowed human brilliance to do what human brilliance can do, which is solve our problems.
Well, I'm certainly inspired. I'm sure that listeners will be as well. How can people support you and your impact?
So thank you for that. People can find us at 8b.africa, the number 8, the letter b.africa. People can follow me on social media at Dr. Lydiah. Lydiah has an H, K Bosire, and that's both on Twitter and on Instagram.
And I'll make sure to include links.
That'll be fantastic. And we would love, on our website, we do have a form where people can express interest, and we actually check the inbox that it goes to. So, please do let us know if you would like, if there are ways that we could be working together to amplify the impact that we are making as a company.
That's wonderful. And I'm excited to engage myself. Hopefully some others will get involved that are listening. And we really, really thank you so much for your time. I'm really excited to help you get this important message out there, and look forward to keeping our conversation going.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jeff.
Thanks for listening to this episode of People Are the Answer. To find out more, go to peoplearetheanswer.com.